Today on Better Book Clubs, Ian McEwan's novel Atonement. I've mentioned Atonement before as one of my favorite luxurious novels of the early 2000s because it has a slower pace and yet it's beautifully written and the characters are so fully developed. So if you and your book club are interested in books that aren't necessarily fast-paced thrillers, but are really more psychological dramas, then Atonement is definitely a great choice for you. And the characters are so fully developed that you'll really feel like they're people that you've gotten to know through the course of the novel. Also, McEwan's sentences are just beautifully crafted. So if you're interested in paying attention to the writing itself, Atonement is also a great choice. Even though Atonement doesn't have a galloping plot line, things do happen, and I just want to read one paragraph to you from the end of chapter 2 to give you both a sense of the movement of the story and also a sense of McEwan's language. This scene takes place at a fountain at the manor house where the young woman in this paragraph lives, and she and her young lover have just met, and a piece of pottery has broken and fallen down into the fountain, and she's gone in after it. So McEwan writes, "When she emerged a few seconds later with a piece of pottery in each hand, he knew better than to offer to help her out of the water. The frail white nymph, from whom water cascaded far more successfully than it did from the beefy Triton, carefully placed the pieces by the vase. She dressed quickly, turning her wet arms with difficulty through her silk sleeves and tucking the unfastened blouse into the skirt. She picked up her sandals and thrust them under her arm, put the fragments in the pocket of her skirt, and took up the vase. Her movements were savage, and she would not meet his eye. He did not exist, he was banished, and this was also the punishment. He stood there dumbly as she walked away from him, barefoot across the lawn, and he watched her darkened hair swing heavily across her shoulders, drenching her blouse. Then he turned and looked into the water in case there was a piece she had missed. It was difficult to see because the roiling surface had yet to recover its tranquility, and the turbulence was driven by the lingering spirit of her fury. He put his hand flat upon the surface as though to quell it. She, meanwhile, had disappeared into the house." The entire action of the first half of the novel, or almost the first half, takes place on this very afternoon at this manor house. It's 1935 in England, and all of the characters, we get a glimpse into a bunch of their thoughts this day, and all of them have kind of petty concerns, but those petty concerns are going to add up to really serious consequences by the end of the day. Once you adjust to the pace of Atonement, there's really nothing difficult about reading it. So there's just a lot of interesting psychological drama happening that you'll want to pay attention to and probably talk about with your book club. But what does become challenging is when you get to part 2 of the novel, about halfway through, and there's a very jarring transition, 5 years ahead into the future, and suddenly McEwan plunks us down in the middle of a World War II battle. The setting of that next part is so different from the setting of the first part of the novel that it can be difficult to kind of reset, which is what you have to do as a reader in order to enter into the second half of the book. But trust McEwan, he knows what he's doing. He's an extremely experienced writer, and just trust that you should follow him into this next section of the book. Ultimately, the novel is made up of 3 sections, but I think the transition into the third and shortest section isn't really quite as difficult because by now you really understand the scope of the book and you've learned to follow McEwan through. I've read a couple of other Ian McEwan novels on Chesil Beach, The Children Act, but he's actually the author of more than a dozen novels. From my experience with him, though, I think Atonement is the best choice for book clubs. For one thing, it has the largest cast of characters, and so there's just more to talk about. And I think there's also a little bit more ambiguity in the story that also makes it a really interesting piece for discussion. I'll leave a link below to an oral history of Atonement, which is kind of interesting. The novel has a very unusual backstory, but I'll just leave you with a quote from Alice Vincent, who wrote the introduction to that oral history. She writes that Atonement unleashes its despair and unease like a dripping tap. gradually and unstoppable until only deluge remains. There's another thought, a critic's thought about Atonement and the kind of novel it is. It maybe starts out very quietly, but there's a lot going on under the surface. I hope you'll give Ian McEwan's novel Atonement a try. If you do, I hope you'll leave some comments below and let me know what you think of it. If you like what you see here, please remember to subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.